On September 11, 1777, General Howe brought 15,500 soldiers to the banks of Brandywine Creek and executed one of the most tactically complete engagements of the entire American Revolutionary War. Washington had 14,600 men, a strong defensive position, and 3 separate warnings that the British were flanking him. He dismissed everyone. The battle lasted 11 hours. Britain won every exchange of it. 2 weeks later, Philadelphia fell. The Continental Congress fled. General Howe had the American capital. More men fought at the Battle of Brandywine than at Yorktown, more than at Saratoga, more than at any other single engagement of the American Revolutionary War. General Howe had done everything right. He had better intelligence than Washington, a superior plan, and an army that performed with precision from the first shot to the last. And within 6 weeks of the most complete British victory of the entire war, Britain lost the American Revolutionary War for good. What General Howe did with that victory and what it cost the British Empire is the real story of the Battle of Brandywine. By the spring of 1777, the American Revolutionary War had settled into something neither side had expected. Britain had the largest professional army in the world, a navy that controlled the coastline, and more resources than the Continental Army could match on any accounting. And yet the rebellion had not been crushed. Washington had survived Long Island, survived the fall of New York, survived the retreat through New Jersey, and crossed the Delaware in December of 1776 to win at Trenton and Princeton. The war was still alive. Something had to change. For General William Howe, the commander of British forces in North America, the problem was not tactical. He had beaten Washington at Long Island with elegant precision, and he knew he could beat him again. The problem was strategic. Winning battles had not ended the rebellion. The Continental Army retreated, regrouped, and reappeared. The American population, far from submitting under military pressure, had hardened. What Howe needed in 1777 was not another victory on the field. He needed a victory that would change the political character of the war. Philadelphia was that victory. Or so Howe believed. The city was the seat of the Continental Congress, the symbolic capital of the new nation, and the largest and most prosperous city in the colonies. Taking it would scatter the Congress, break the morale of the patriot cause, and, most importantly to Howe and to London, activate the loyalist population of Pennsylvania. British intelligence had consistently reported that Pennsylvania was full of men who remained loyal to the crown and were waiting for a British army to arrive before declaring themselves. Philadelphia, in this calculation, was the key that would unlock the rebellion's underbelly. The broader British plan for 1777 had originally been more ambitious. General John Burgoyne would lead an army south from Canada through Lake Champlain and down the Hudson River Valley. Howe would march north from New York to meet him. Together, they would sever New England from the rest of the colonies, cutting off the most militant region of the rebellion, strangling its supply lines, and forcing a confrontation the Continental Army could not survive. It was a sound plan on paper. It required both armies to move in coordination. That coordination never happened. The breakdown was not a matter of orders being disobeyed. It was a matter of 2 plans being approved simultaneously by a ministry in London that did not fully understand what each general was actually proposing. Lord George Germain, the Secretary of State for America, approved Burgoyne's plan for the Northern Campaign and separately approved Howe's plan for the Philadelphia campaign without clearly establishing which took priority or how the two were to be coordinated. The result was 2 British armies operating in the same war without a shared objective, each pursuing a different version of how to end it. Howe compounded the confusion by choosing to move on Philadelphia by sea rather than overland. On July 23, 1777, he embarked 16,500 men onto his brother Admiral Richard Howe's fleet at Sandy Hook, New Jersey, and sailed south. The decision bewildered his own officers and confounded Washington, who spent weeks trying to determine where the fleet was going. It also removed Howe's army from any possible support of Burgoyne for the entire summer campaign. While Burgoyne moved south through New York with 8,000 men and no prospect of reinforcement, Howe's army was at sea. The sea voyage was miserable. The fleet encountered contrary winds, summer heat, and poor conditions below decks that left soldiers and horses weakened before a single shot had been fired. What Howe had expected to be a swift passage became a 3-week ordeal that did not end until August 25, 1777, when the Army finally disembarked at Head of Elk, Maryland, at the northern end of Chesapeake Bay. Philadelphia was still 50 miles away. The army that landed was not in the same condition as the army that had embarked. It needed time to recover before it could fight. Washington had used those weeks well. Once the British fleet appeared in the Chesapeake, he understood Howe's destination and moved his army south to block the approach to Philadelphia. On August 24, 1777, Washington marched his 14,600 men through the streets of Philadelphia, deliberately, publicly, with drums and fifes, to show the population of the city and the members of Congress who watched from the footpaths that the Continental Army was present, prepared, and willing to fight for the capital. It was a piece of theater as much as a military movement. Washington understood the political dimension of what he was doing. The position Washington chose to defend was along Brandywine Creek, a river running roughly north to south through southeastern Pennsylvania, approximately 25 miles southwest of Philadelphia. The creek was not wide or deep enough to be an impenetrable barrier, but it was crossable only at certain fords, specific points where the water was shallow enough for men and artillery to pass. Washington's plan was to block every ford, concentrate his strength at Chad's Ford in the center where the main road to Philadelphia crossed, and force Howe into a frontal assault against a prepared American position on high ground. It was a sound defensive plan. Its soundness depended entirely on one assumption, that Washington knew where all the fords were. He did not. The Brandywine watershed was more complex than Washington's maps showed. 2 branches of the creek converged south of the main American position, the West Branch and the East Branch, and the network of fords across both branches extended further north than Washington had accounted for. 2 crossings in particular, Trimble's Ford on the West Branch and Jeffers Ford on the East Branch, lay well to the north of the American right flank. Washington's line ended before it reached them. They were open, and General Howe knew it. Howe's intelligence operation in Pennsylvania was one of the most effective of the entire war. For weeks before the battle, his cavalry had been ranging across the countryside, mapping every ford, measuring every road, counting every regiment in Washington's line. His loyalist network, farmers, merchants, and landowners sympathetic to the Crown who knew the Brandywine country intimately, filled in what the cavalry could not reach. By the eve of the battle, Howe had a more complete picture of Washington's dispositions than Washington had of his own. He knew about Trimble's Ford, he knew about Jeffers Ford, he knew the gap was there. Washington's intelligence, by contrast, was fragmentary and contradictory. He had cavalry, but not enough and not well deployed. His local sources were unreliable in a county where Loyalist and Quaker sympathies ran deep. The reports that reached his headquarters described British movements in general terms without the specificity that operational planning required. Washington believed he had covered all the significant fords. He had not been told otherwise in terms clear enough to change that belief. The gap in his right flank was invisible to him on the morning of September 11, 1777, because no one in his command had found it. The Quaker communities of Chester County present one of the more uncomfortable chapters of the Brandywine campaign. The Society of Friends, committed to pacifism and to honest dealing, had deep roots in southeastern Pennsylvania. William Penn had founded the colony in part as a haven for Quaker settlement. Many Quakers refused to take sides in the war as a matter of religious principle. Others, whose theological tradition inclined them toward deference to established authority, provided the British with the local knowledge their cavalry could not gather alone. The precise intelligence Howe had about the unguarded fords came partly from men who knew that ground from a lifetime of living on it. Howe's plan for the battle took full advantage of everything his intelligence had given him. It had 2 parts, operating simultaneously. Lieutenant General Wilhelm von Knyphausen would lead approximately 7,000 Hessian and British troops directly against Washington's position at Chad's Ford. Knyphausen's task was not to break through. It was to hold Washington in place, to press against the American front with enough force and noise that Washington would keep his attention and his reserves focused on the center and never look north toward his right. While Knyphausen fixed Washington at the front, Howe himself would lead a flanking column of approximately 9,000 men, the elite of the British Army, including the foot guards and the light infantry, on an 18-mile march north and east through the Pennsylvania countryside. The column would cross Trimble's Ford and then Jefferys Ford, swing south behind the American right flank, and descend on Washington's position from the direction Washington was not watching. If the plan worked, Washington would be fighting two battles simultaneously, one in front that he expected and one behind him that he had no idea was coming. It was, in its architecture, identical to the plan Howe had used at Long Island the previous year, where a flanking column had passed through Jamaica Pass while a diversion held the American attention at the front. At Long Island, the pass had been guarded by 5 men. At Brandywine, the unguarded fords were not guarded at all. Howe had executed this plan before, against the same opponent, and it had produced the largest American defeat of the war. He had no reason to believe it would not produce the same result again. He was right. Washington had reason to expect a flanking attempt. Howe's tactical signature was well established by 1777. He had used the same two-part plan, diversion at the front, flanking column around the end, 5 times in the previous year of campaigning. Any serious study of Howe's methods would have identified the pattern. Washington's own officers knew about Long Island. Some had been there. The question of whether Washington adequately prepared for what Howe was most likely to do is one that historians have debated since the battle ended, and the answer is uncomfortable. He did not. The night of September 10, 1777, Howe's army camped at Kennett Square, a small Pennsylvania village approximately 8 miles southwest of Chadds Ford. The flanking column would move before dawn. Howe had his orders prepared and his commanders briefed. The intelligence was precise, the plan was tested, and the army was in good condition after its weeks of recovery from the sea voyage. There was nothing about the situation that suggested the morning would go wrong. Howe went to sleep that night as a commander who had done this before, who knew exactly what he was doing, and who had every reason to expect the result that his preparation had earned. Across the creek, Washington's headquarters at the Benjamin Ring House near Chadds Ford was quieter than the situation warranted. Washington had posted his divisions along the creek, placed his artillery on the high ground east of the ford, and established his cavalry screen to the front. He had sent orders to General John Sullivan, commanding the right flank, to watch the roads to the north and report any British movement in that direction. Sullivan's patrols went out. What they found and what they reported would become one of the most consequential intelligence failures of the entire American Revolutionary War. The armies that would fight at Brandywine on September 11, 1777, were the two most experienced forces that had yet faced each other in the war. They had been shaped by 2 years of campaigning, housed by the disciplines of a professional army that had won consistently, Washington's by the harder education of an army that had survived losing and learned something from it. The men on both sides of the creek that night had earned their understanding of war at Long Island and Trenton and Princeton. They were not the forces that had clashed in 1775. They were something more capable, more dangerous, and, on one side at least, more certain of what the morning would bring. What the morning brought was fog. A heavy white mist rose from the creek before dawn on September 11 and settled across the Pennsylvania countryside, reducing visibility to a few dozen yards in places. It was the kind of fog that makes a planned operation both easier and harder. Easier because it concealed movement, harder because it slowed communication and disoriented men moving through unfamiliar ground. For Howe's flanking column, moving north through country his guides knew well, the fog was a convenience. For Washington's pickets, trying to track British movements across a landscape they could barely see, it was a problem that would compound every other problem of the day. The largest battle of the American Revolutionary War was about to begin. It would last 11 hours. It would involve more men than any other engagement of the conflict. It would end with the British in possession of the field, the road to Philadelphia open, and the Continental Army in retreat. and it would set in motion a chain of consequences that neither Howe nor anyone else in the British command fully understood until it was too late to reverse them. The intelligence operation that gave Howe his picture of the Brandywine defenses had been running for weeks before the battle. From the moment the British Army landed at Head of Elk in late August 1777 and began its march north toward Philadelphia, Howe's scouts and his loyalist networks had been working the Pennsylvania countryside with a thoroughness that Washington's command could not match. By the eve of the battle, Howe knew more about the ground than most of Washington's own officers did. The single most important figure in Howe's intelligence operation was not a cavalry officer or a spy. He was Joseph Galloway, a prominent Pennsylvania lawyer, former member of the Continental Congress, and committed loyalist who had fled Philadelphia to join the British in New York after it became clear the Patriot cause would not tolerate neutrality. Galloway had lived his entire life in Chester County. He knew every road, every ford, every farm track in the Brandywine watershed. Howe brought him along on the Philadelphia campaign specifically for this purpose, and Galloway delivered. Galloway's local knowledge was supplemented by British cavalry reconnaissance and by other loyalist residents of the area who provided information about terrain and American positions. The Queen's Rangers, a loyalist battalion that formed part of Knyphausen's vanguard, operated as scouts as well as soldiers. Together, these sources built Howe an operational picture that was specific enough to plan on with confidence. The unguarded fords at Trimble's and Jefferus, both above the forks of the Brandywine, appeared in Howe's planning not by inference but by direct intelligence. He knew they were open. He knew exactly where they were. Washington's intelligence picture was the opposite in almost every respect. He had deployed his most capable scouts, the riflemen under Colonel Daniel Morgan, but even they could not compensate for the fundamental disadvantage of operating in a county where Loyalist and Quaker sympathies ran deep. The local population that freely helped Howe's officers find their way around the watershed was the same population that declined to share what it knew with Washington's patrols. The reports reaching Washington's headquarters were incomplete, contradictory, and shaped by the assumption that he had already covered every significant ford. That assumption was wrong. The Brandywine watershed was more complex than Washington's maps showed. Two branches of the creek converged south of the main American position, the West Branch and the East Branch, and the network of crossings extended considerably further north than Washington had accounted for. Trimble's Ford on the West Branch and Jefferus Ford on the East Branch lay well beyond the northern end of his line. Washington believed he had blocked all meaningful crossings. He had not been told otherwise in terms clear enough to shake that belief. The gap in his right flank was invisible to him. Howe's plan, finalized at Kennett Square on the evening of September 10, 1777, was built precisely around that gap. Knyphausen would march 800 men east along the Nottingham Road before dawn and make contact with the American forward positions at Chad's Ford. His task was not to break through, but to hold Washington's attention at the front, to create enough noise and pressure that Washington would keep his reserves facing the creek and never look north toward his right flank. At 5 in the morning on September 11, Howe and Cornwallis departed Kennett Square with 8,200 men and began their march north along the Great Valley Road. Cornwallis's column was the heart of the plan. It contained the Foot Guards, the light infantry battalions, the Grenadiers, and Hessian units, the finest troops in Howe's army. Guided by Galloway and other local men who knew the roads, the column moved north through the fog, crossed the West Branch of the Brandywine at Trimble's Ford, then crossed the East Branch at Jefferus Ford, and turned south to emerge behind the American right flank. The march covered 17 miles of Pennsylvania countryside and took approximately 9 hours to complete. The British appeared on the American right at around 2 in the afternoon. Howe rode with Cornwallis. This meant the British commander was absent from the diversion at Chad's Ford and unreachable for most of the day. Knyphausen would have to manage his engagement on his own judgment, maintaining enough pressure to hold Washington in place without overcommitting before the main attack arrived. Knyphausen's vanguard, led by the Queen's Rangers and Major Patrick Ferguson's riflemen, made contact with American forward pickets near Welch's Tavern at around 6 in the morning. The skirmishing that followed was exactly what Howe's plan required. Washington's morning was shaped entirely by the noise at the front. Knyphausen's engagement at Chad's Ford was sharp enough to hold Washington's attention south and west, toward the creek, toward the ford, toward the sounds confirming the British were where he expected them to be. What was happening 12 miles to the north, on the back roads between Kennett Square and Trimble's Ford, was not visible from Washington's headquarters and was not yet in any report reaching his desk. The intelligence failure at Brandywine was not a failure to receive information. It was a failure to act on information that arrived in time to make a difference. The first significant warning of the flanking movement came from Lieutenant Colonel James Ross, who was scouting the Great Valley Road with a mixed force of militia and dragoons. Shortly before noon, Ross sent a written dispatch to Washington reporting that a large British force, he estimated 50 men with 16 to 18 field pieces, was marching along the road toward Trimble's and Jefferis Fords. Ross's report was specific and credible. It named a road, gave numbers, and identified a direction. It was the clearest warning Washington received all day, and within the hour, it was contradicted. The contradiction came from Sullivan. At around 12:30, Sullivan forwarded a message to Washington reporting that Major Joseph Spear of the Chester County Militia had come from the area of Martin's Tavern at the forks of the Brandywine that morning and had heard nothing of any British force in the northern sector. Spear was confident, Sullivan reported, that no enemy column was in that quarter. Sullivan concluded that Colonel Hazen's earlier reports of British movement must be wrong. Washington had Ross's written dispatch in one hand and Sullivan's reassurance relaying Spear's account in the other. He chose Sullivan's reassurance. Major Joseph Spear had not checked the right roads. He had come from Martin's Tavern in the Forks area, a route that did not cover the ground along which Cornwallis's column was actually marching. His conclusion that the northern sector was clear was accurate for the roads he had personally traveled, and entirely wrong for the roads he had not. Sullivan did not know this. Washington did not know it. Cornwallis was crossing Jefferis Ford at approximately the same time Washington read Sullivan's message telling him the north was clear. The fog that had covered the morning began to lift around noon. As visibility improved, reports from the American right became more alarming. A dust cloud was observed rising to the north, the kind of cloud that a column of 200 men and artillery raises on a dry road in late summer. Washington received this report and finally began to take the northern threat more seriously. He sent Major John Jameson to investigate. Jameson rode northward, found nothing on the roads he checked, and reported to Sullivan at around 9 that the area was clear, a report based on routes that, like Spear's, did not cover the actual British line of march. It was at this point that Squire Thomas Cheney rode hard to Washington's headquarters at the Ring House. Cheney was a local farmer and member of the Chester County Militia who had gone out on his own initiative and personally encountered Howe's column in the field. He understood exactly what he had seen and rode 7 miles to the Ring House to deliver the warning. He was initially greeted with skepticism. He was not a military officer, and his report contradicted the reassurances Washington had just received. One account records that Cheney demanded to be taken to Washington directly and told him to put him under guard until his report proved correct. Washington received him but remained unconvinced. What finally moved Washington to act was not Cheney's warning alone but its convergence with a cavalry report from Colonel Theodoric Bland. Bland sent word to Sullivan at around 2 in the afternoon that the enemy was in the rear of the American right, approximately 2 miles away and coming down. He had seen dust rising in the country for an hour. Sullivan forwarded Bland's report to Washington. Bland's report, coming from a cavalry officer rather than a civilian farmer, carried the authority that Cheney's had lacked. Taken together with Cheney's account, it finally convinced Washington that Howe was behind his right flank. It was just past 2 in the afternoon. The attack was less than 2 hours away. The hours between Ross's credible noon dispatch and Washington's decision to act at 2 in the afternoon represent one of the most consequential 2-hour windows in the entire Revolutionary War. During those 2 hours, Washington could have repositioned his right flank, reinforced the northern approaches, or placed his army in a posture that made the flanking attack less catastrophic when it came. He spent those 2 hours managing Knyphausen's engagement at the front, which was precisely what Howe had designed them for. The plan had worked not just on the battlefield, but inside Washington's headquarters in the hours before a single British soldier appeared on the American right. The contrast between the two intelligence pictures, Howe's precise integrated, Galloway-guided knowledge of every ford and road in the watershed against Washington's fragmentary, contradicted, and ultimately paralyzing uncertainty, was not an accident. It was the product of months of preparation on one side and an insufficient appreciation of what was unknown on the other. Howe had invested in knowing the ground. Washington had invested in defending the ground he thought he knew. The difference between those two approaches decided the battle before it began. There is something worth sitting with in the sequence of warnings that reached Washington that morning. Ross's dispatch, Chinese ride, Bland's cavalry report, all of them were pointing in the same direction. Each was dismissed or delayed or outweighed by a contradicting source that turned out to be wrong. Washington was not presented with one clear warning and chose to ignore it. He was presented with a morning full of conflicting information in which the true reports and the false ones arrived in almost equal measure, and in which the false ones consistently confirmed what he already believed. That is a harder kind of intelligence failure to explain than simple negligence, and it is a more human one. Howe reached the high ground east of Jeffress Ford with his column at around 2 in the afternoon and began deploying his 200 men for the assault. The foot guards and grenadiers moved into position. The artillery was unlimbered. Below them, to the south, the American right flank was scrambling to form a line it had not expected to need in a direction it had not expected to face. Sullivan was moving his 3 divisions north toward Birmingham Meeting House on roads they had not reconnoitered. The men were marching fast and forming up on ground they were seeing for the first time. Against them were coming the finest troops in Howe's army, rested after their morning march, commanded by officers who knew exactly where they were going. The gap between what Howe knew and what Washington knew had produced, in the space of a single morning, a battle that was already decided before Cornwallis's first volley. Not decided in the sense that courage or discipline no longer mattered. They would matter enormously in the hours ahead, and the men who fought on Birmingham Hill would demonstrate both. But decided in the sense that the shape of the engagement, the position of the forces, and the tactical situations Washington would spend the afternoon managing were all products of an intelligence failure that no amount of fighting could fully correct. Howe had won the morning. The afternoon would confirm it. The morning of September 11, 1777, opened with a dense white fog lying across the Pennsylvania countryside. It muffled sound, reduced visibility to a few dozen yards in places, and gave the day an eerie, suspended quality that soldiers on both sides of the Brandywine would remember long afterward. For Knyphausen's column, marching east along the Nottingham Road toward Chad's Ford before dawn, the fog was a convenience. For Washington's forward pickets, posted on the west bank of the Brandywine and trying to track British movements, it was one more obstacle in a morning that would accumulate obstacles faster than any one man could process them. Knyphausen's vanguard made contact with American forces near Welch's Tavern at around 6 in the morning. The Queen's Rangers and Major Patrick Ferguson's riflemen pressed forward along the road and encountered Brigadier General William Maxwell's light infantry, which Washington had positioned on the west bank of the creek, specifically to slow any British advance and buy time. Maxwell's men fought from behind stone walls and fence lines, giving ground deliberately and making the British pay for every yard. The skirmishing was sharp and sustained. It announced the battle to everyone within earshot and pulled Washington's attention firmly toward the front. The fighting around Kennett Meeting House went on through the mid-morning as Maxwell's men fell back toward the creek in good order. The Quakers inside the meeting house continued their midweek service as the battle moved around them. One of them later wrote that while there was much noise and confusion without, all was quiet and peaceful within. It was the kind of detail that captures something true about the way this particular county experienced the war. a population committed to non-violence holding its forms while armies tore the ground apart outside the walls. By mid-morning, Kyffhausen had pushed Maxwell back across the Brandywine and established his artillery on the high ground west of Chad's Ford. The two armies faced each other across the creek, exchanging cannon fire through the late morning in what historians have called the mid-morning lull, a period of sustained artillery exchange with no significant infantry movement on either side. For Washington, managing the situation from his headquarters at the Ring House, the pattern was consistent with a major frontal assault building toward its climax. Everything pointed toward Chad's Ford as the main effort. Everything Howe had designed pointed that way too. While Kyffhausen's guns worked the American position at Chad's Ford, Cornwallis's column was still marching. The 200 men had crossed Trimble's Ford on the west branch of the Brandywine between roughly 10:30 and 11 in the morning, waded the creek, and continued east toward Jefferys Ford on the east branch. Howe crossed Jefferys Ford between 1 and 1:30 in the afternoon. After crossing, the column marched past Sconnelltown and reached Osborne's Hill, approximately 3.5 miles northwest of Birmingham Meeting House. Howe halted the column there at around 2:30, allowing the men to rest and eat after their 17-mile march in the late summer heat. The attack would go in when the men were ready. The pause at Osborne's Hill gave the Americans approximately 90 minutes between the first confirmed sightings of Cornwallis's column and the opening of the British assault on the right flank. It was in those 90 minutes that Washington finally acted on the intelligence he had been receiving since noon. He ordered the divisions of Lord Stirling and Major General Adam Stephen, which had been held as reserves near his headquarters, to march north toward Birmingham Meeting House and form a line to receive the British attack. He also ordered Sullivan to leave his position at Brinton's Ford and move north to join them. Sullivan, as the senior officer, would command the combined right wing. The movement north was hurried, confused, and conducted on ground that none of the American officers had reconnoitered. Stirling's and Stevens' divisions covered approximately 3 miles in roughly 30 minutes, which was fast enough for men moving in column on an unfamiliar road toward a battle they had not expected to fight in this direction. When they arrived near Birmingham Meeting House, they had to form a defensive line on ground they were seeing for the first time, without adequate maps, without time to sight their artillery properly, and with Sullivan's division still en route from Brinton's Ford and arriving on the wrong side of the forming line. Sullivan's movement from Brinton's Ford compounded the confusion. As the ranking officer, Sullivan took overall command of the right wing when he arrived, but his approach to the forming line brought his division in from the left rather than extending the right, creating a gap in the American position at the moment the British were about to attack. The American line at Birmingham Meeting House on the afternoon of September 11, 1777 was the product of a hurried march, a late decision, and a command structure trying to impose order on a situation that had been moving faster than the orders issued to manage it. Howe began his assault at around 4 in the afternoon. The British advanced in 3 columns against the American line on Birmingham Hill, the high ground just south of the meeting house where Stirling and Stephen had placed their men. The foot guards led the attack on the left, the grenadiers in the center, and the light infantry on the right. They came on in good order, well-dressed lines moving uphill against a position the Americans had occupied less than an hour before. One British officer later described the leaves falling as in autumn by the grape shot. The American artillery opened as the columns advanced. The British kept coming. The fighting on Birmingham Hill was fierce. The American divisions of Stirling and Stephen met the British advance with sustained musketry and held their ground longer than the situation perhaps warranted. Stirling's men fought the brigade of guards to a standstill on the left before the weight of the British assault began to tell. Stephen's division on the right held the high ground through multiple British attempts to clear it. What the Americans could not compensate for was the gap in their line, the space between Sullivan's arriving division and the existing American position, which gave the British a corridor through which to pour men and artillery that no amount of courage in the individual units could close. Sullivan's own division, arriving late and on the wrong axis, struggled to form up under fire. Sullivan had served at Long Island the previous year and had been captured there. He had spent months in British custody before being exchanged. He understood what it meant to fight a battle that was already lost before the shooting started. What he faced at Birmingham Meeting House was a version of the same problem. Troops arriving in pieces, ground they did not know, an enemy already in position, and he managed it with the resources available to him, which were not enough. The American line on Birmingham Hill began to give way at around 5 in the afternoon. Not all at once. The collapse was piecemeal, division by division, as the British pressure on each segment became too great to sustain. Stirling's men fell back first on the left, then Stevens on the right, then Sullivan's in the center. The retreat was not a rout in the early stages. Units pulled back in recognizable order, reforming on the next piece of ground behind them, turning to fire again before falling back again. But the direction of movement was consistently rearward, and the ground between the American Army and Chester, where Washington intended to regroup, was open country without natural defensive positions. At Chad's Ford, Knyphausen had been waiting for the sound of Cornwallis's assault to the north. When the guns opened on Birmingham Hill at around 4 in the afternoon, Knyphausen converted his feint into a frontal assault. His troops crossed the Brandywine under fire and drove toward the American position on the east bank. Anthony Wayne, commanding the defense of Chad's Ford with the Pennsylvania line, met the crossing with artillery fire and musketry volleys that staggered the advancing Hessians and British at the water's edge. Wayne held his ground and yielded nothing while the fighting raged. Wayne's performance at Chad's Ford on September 11, 1777, was one of the most underappreciated military achievements of the entire Philadelphia campaign. He was outnumbered. He had been fighting since before dawn, and his right flank was uncovered as Sullivan's divisions pulled back from Birmingham Hill. He received no reinforcement and no clear orders to withdraw until Washington directly ordered him to pull back toward Chester after nightfall. Wayne and his Pennsylvania line held Knyphausen in check for the entire course of the battle, yielding ground only when directly ordered to. The left of the American line did not collapse. It was ordered back. Washington had recognized by mid-afternoon that the collapse of his right flank could end the campaign entirely if the Continental Army was enveloped. He pulled Nathaniel Greene's division out of the line at Chad's Ford, removing one of his best units from the defensive position it had been holding, and ordered it north to cover the retreat from Birmingham Hill. Greene moved with the speed that had already become his tactical signature. His division covered 4 miles in approximately 45 minutes, arriving south of Dilworth in time to form a line across the road the retreating Americans needed to use to reach Chester. Greene's stand south of Dilworth was the hinge on which the survival of the Continental Army turned. His division formed across the road and held the pursuing British for nearly an hour, fighting from behind whatever cover the ground offered and counterattacking along the ridge at Dilworth in exchanges that one British officer described as the most severe fighting of the day. The British Grenadiers and the brigade pressed forward and were met with fire that stopped them, long enough for Sullivan's, Stirling's, and Stevens' broken divisions to pass through Greene's line and continue south toward Chester. Greene bought the time. Washington used it. The fighting south of Dilworth ended as darkness fell. Howe's army was in command of the field but too exhausted after their 17-mile march and hours of combat to pursue effectively. The British did not press beyond Dilworth in force. Washington's army reached Chester that night, battered, having left most of its artillery on the hill at Birmingham Meeting House when the horses pulling the guns were lost in the fighting, but intact as a fighting force. Washington wrote to the Continental Congress that evening, reporting the defeat and noting that he was happy to find the troops in good spirits. The casualties of September 11, 1777, reflected the intensity and duration of the fighting. The Americans lost an estimated 1,300 men. Approximately 200 dead, 500 to 600 wounded, and 400 captured. The British suffered approximately 583 killed and wounded, a significantly lower butcher's bill for the winning side in an 11-hour engagement, and a reflection of how completely the flanking movement had shaped the battle to British advantage before the fighting even began. The Americans had lost men in proportion to their tactical disadvantage. The British had lost men in proportion to their tactical success. Among the Continental wounded that afternoon was a young officer who had been attached to Washington's staff and had gone forward to observe the fighting on Birmingham Hill. He was 19 years old, had never been in combat before, and had arrived in America only weeks earlier after crossing the Atlantic on his own initiative and against the direct orders of his king. When Sullivan's line began to break on Birmingham Hill, he was not an observer anymore. He rode into the retreating men and began organizing the withdrawal, trying to hold the dissolving line together in the smoke and confusion of an engagement he had no authority to command. A British musket ball struck his leg. He did not leave the field. The Marquis de Lafayette's conduct on Birmingham Hill on September 11, 1777, was not the act of a man performing heroism for an audience. It was the instinctive response of someone who looked at a collapsing situation and did the thing that the situation required, regardless of his own authority or his own safety. He was a staff officer with an observer's role and a wound that would have justified any decision to withdraw. He stayed. He rallied. He kept men moving in an organized direction when the alternative was dissolution. What that instinct cost him that afternoon, and what it produced in the years that followed, belongs to the next part of this story. The Battle of September 11, 1777, ended with darkness. Howe held the field. Washington's army was in retreat toward Chester. Philadelphia lay open to the north. The Continental Army had been flanked, driven from its position, and forced to abandon most of its artillery. By every standard measure, Britain had won a complete and decisive victory. The army that had arrived at Birmingham Meeting House less than 90 minutes before the British assault had been driven off it in under 2 hours of fighting. The plan Howe had designed at Kennett Square the night before had worked in every particular. What Howe did not yet know, what would become clear only in the weeks following, was that the thing the plan had been designed to produce was not there. The Continental Army was not destroyed. It was not captured. It was retreating in good order toward Chester, still commanded by Washington, still coherent enough to fight again. Greene had held the road. Wayne had held the ford. Washington had chosen retreat over annihilation. The 11 hours of fighting on September 11, 1777, had produced a perfect British tactical victory and left the question of the war exactly where it had been the morning before. Britain had won everything and changed nothing. Philadelphia was still 15 days away, and everything else was about to change in ways that Howe's plan had made inevitable. The battle is sometimes called the Battle of Brandywine Creek, and sometimes simply Brandywine. It was fought on a Tuesday. The Birmingham Friends Meeting House, where the Quakers held their service while the armies formed around them, still stands. The graves in its adjacent cemetery include men who fell on Birmingham Hill that afternoon and were buried where they lay. The ground is quiet now. On September 11, 1777, it was the loudest and most consequential piece of earth in the American Revolutionary War, and what happened there decided less than Howe believed and more than Washington yet understood. There is a footnote to the day that sits at the edge of documented history and refuses to go away entirely. During the early fighting near Chad's Ford, a British officer named Captain Patrick Ferguson, the inventor of the Ferguson breech-loading rifle and one of the finest marksmen in the British Army, observed 2 mounted American officers through the undergrowth at close range. One wore a large cocked hat and carried himself with unmistakable authority. Ferguson had a clear shot. He chose not to take it, writing afterward that it was not pleasant to fire at the back of an inoffending individual who was acquitting himself very coolly of his duty. Some historians believe the officer in the cocked hat was George Washington. Ferguson never learned who it was. He was wounded later that same afternoon. A nation's history turns on smaller things than most people are comfortable admitting. September 11, 1777, was an 11-hour day of fighting that ended with the British in possession of the field and the Americans in retreat toward Chester. It was the largest battle by troops engaged of the entire Revolutionary War. It was the longest single-day battle of the conflict. It produced the conditions for the fall of Philadelphia, and it also produced, in its final hours, the decisions and the men who would carry the Continental Army through what came next. through Valley Forge, through the years that remained, to the end of a war that Howe believed he had already won. Darkness brought no resolution, it brought only a pause. Howe rested his exhausted army on the field they had won. Washington counted his dead and his missing, and wrote his letter to Congress. Greene's men stood down from their position south of Dilworth and began the march to Chester. Wayne's Pennsylvania line pulled back from Chad's Ford in good order, the last American unit to leave the creek they had defended since before dawn. Somewhere on the road south, the 19-year-old Frenchman with a musket ball in his leg was being helped toward Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where the Moravian community had opened its buildings to the wounded. He would rejoin the army 2 months later at Valley Forge. The army would not be the same army he had left, neither would he. The fog that had opened the day had long since burned off by the time darkness fell on September 11, 1777. The sky was clear. The Pennsylvania countryside, scarred by the passage of 30 soldiers and hours of artillery fire, lay silent in the autumn dark. Philadelphia was 25 miles to the northeast. The Continental Congress was still there, for the moment, trying to understand what the letters arriving from Chester were telling them. What they were telling them was that the largest battle of the American Revolutionary War was over. Britain had won it. The war was not over. And what happened next would prove to be more consequential than anything that had happened that day. The 11 hours of September 11, 1777, produced a British victory so complete that it should, by any reasonable military logic, have ended the rebellion. It did not. The reasons why it did not, the decisions made in the retreat, the men who held the roads, the chain of consequence that ran from Brandywine to Saratoga to the French alliance to Yorktown, are the rest of this story. But none of that chain begins without understanding what happened on Birmingham Hill in the late afternoon of that September day, and why the army that walked away from it intact was already, without knowing it, on its way to winning the war. The Continental Army's survival at Brandywine was not the result of a single decision or a single man. It was the product of several specific human choices made in the space of a few hours, by men in different parts of the battlefield who could not see what the others were doing and had no way of knowing whether any of them would succeed. What those choices had in common was this: each of them bought time, and in a battle already lost, time was the only currency that mattered. The first of those choices belonged to Nathanael Greene. Washington had positioned Greene's division at Chad's Ford as part of the main defensive line along the creek. When the collapse of the right flank at Birmingham Hill threatened to unravel the entire army, Washington pulled Greene out of the line and ordered him north to cover the retreat. It was a decision that weakened the position at Chad's Ford. At the moment Knyphausen was preparing to press his assault, Washington made it anyway. He understood that the army escaping the field intact mattered more than any single position. Greene moved with the speed that would define his military reputation throughout the war. His division covered 4 miles of rough Pennsylvania ground in approximately 45 minutes, a pace that one account described as nearly impossible for 18th-century infantry carrying full kit. Brigadier General George Whedon's brigade led the march, running most of the way, arriving at the intersection of Birmingham Road and Wilmington Road, south of Dilworth, at around 6 in the afternoon. Greene quickly formed his men in a line through the trees along the retreat route, placing his riflemen, mostly Virginians, on high ground that dominated the road the retreating Americans needed to use to reach Chester. The stand south of Dilworth was fierce and deliberately so. Greene's men and Knox's artillery caught the pursuing British by surprise, firing into the column as it came through the smoke and the failing light of a September evening. The British main column stopped. Charges and countercharges followed through the area known as Sandy Hollow and along the road south of town. Greene's division held its position for nearly an hour, long enough for the remnants of Sullivan's, Sterling's, and Stevens' broken divisions to pass through the line and continue south toward Chester. Without Greene's stand, the retreat from Birmingham Hill had nowhere to go except into British hands. Washington arrived at Greene's position at around 6 in the evening and conferred with Greene and Knox in the yard of the William Brinton House. The situation was clear. The right had collapsed, the army was retreating, and the only question was whether enough of it would reach Chester intact to fight again. Knox deployed artillery to slow the British advance. Greene's men held their position until the last of the retreating columns had passed through. When darkness finally fell and the British pursuit ground to a halt, Greene began his own march to Chester. His division was the last organized American formation to leave the field. 3 miles to the south, at Chadds Ford, Anthony Wayne had been fighting since before dawn. His Pennsylvania line had held the American left through the entire course of the battle, absorbing Knyphausen's artillery bombardment through the long morning, refusing to give ground when the Hessians pressed forward, holding the ford against a force that outnumbered him significantly. Wayne fought from behind the creek with musketry and grape shot, and the accounts of men present describe the fighting at the water's edge as the fiercest sustained exchange of the entire battle, the creek itself barely holding the weight of Knyphausen's assault. Wayne held. Ground gained and ground lost at Chadds Ford was measured in yards, not miles. When Knyphausen heard the guns open on Birmingham Hill to the north at 4 in the afternoon, he converted his feint into a full assault. His troops crossed the Brandywine with bayonets and drove toward the American position on the east bank. Wayne met the crossing with everything he had. The left side of his line, where militia were posted, eventually gave way under the pressure of the bayonet advance, and Knyphausen's men captured the hill at Chadds Ford along with 4 of Proctor's artillery pieces. Wayne and the Pennsylvania line fell back through orchards and fields toward Dilworthtown, fighting as they went, slowing Knyphausen's advance with every yard they yielded. Wayne received no reinforcement and no order to withdraw until Washington directly instructed him to pull back toward Chester after nightfall. He had fought for more than 12 hours. He had held Knyphausen in check for the entire battle, yielding his position only when directly ordered to and only when the rest of the army had already retreated past him. In the words of Major General John Armstrong, who observed the fighting, Wayne and the Pennsylvania line yielded nothing and held their position at Chadds Ford, notwithstanding the weight and vigor of Knyphausen's attack. It was not the action of a man who had been defeated. It was the action of a man who had been ordered to stop. There is a footnote to the fighting at Chadds Ford that sits at the edge of the official record and has never been entirely confirmed. Among the men present at the ford that afternoon was a black teamster named Edward Hector, serving with Proctor's artillery. When the American position on the hill at Chadds Ford was overrun and officers ordered the men to abandon what they could not carry, Hector refused to leave his wagon and horses. He collected the weapons left on the ground around him, loaded them into his munitions wagon, and drove it off the field through the advancing British. He saved the weapons, he saved the horses, he saved himself. His name does not appear in any official commendation of the battle. The third man whose decision shaped the Army's survival was not a general. He was not yet 20 years old. He held no command at Brandywine. He had been sent to the battle as an observer, attached to Washington's staff in a role that gave him authority over nothing and responsibility for no one. He had crossed the Atlantic to fight in a war that was not his, against the explicit orders of his king, motivated by a belief in a cause he had read about in the newspapers of Paris. He had never been in combat before. His name was Marie-Joseph Paul-Yves Roch Gilbert du Motier, known to the American Army and to history as the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette had arrived in America in the spring of 1777, 19 years old, and had been attached to Washington's headquarters as a volunteer major general, an honorary rank that came without a command. Washington had initially been skeptical of the young Frenchman, one of several European officers who had arrived claiming high rank and expecting immediate authority. But Lafayette was different from the others in one specific way. He had not come to command. He had come to serve. He had told Washington directly that he wished to learn, not to lead. Washington was persuaded, and the two men had formed a friendship of unusual depth in the weeks before Brandywine. On September 11, 1777, Lafayette rode with a group of French officers to the fighting at Birmingham Hill to observe. What he found when he arrived was not a battle that could be observed from a safe distance. Sullivan's line was breaking. Conway's brigade was dissolving. The men around him were moving in the wrong direction. Lafayette later described the moment in a letter to his wife, writing that the wound had come at the very moment when part of the line gave way, but that a part still held its ground. He had been on foot. A part of the line had given way, but a part still held its ground. To those who still held, he went, to encourage his comrades, and to show them he had no better chance of flight than they. He ordered his horse to the rear. Lafayette tried to force Conway's men to hold their position. He rode along the breaking line, shouting orders he had no authority to give to men who had no reason to obey him. He attempted to organize a bayonet charge. The Americans, unused to that form of fighting and already in motion toward the rear, did not respond as he wanted. Then a British musket ball struck his leg. The wound was real, deep enough that the surgeons would need weeks to close it properly, and in the smoke and confusion of a collapsing fight, it was the kind of wound that gives a man a reason to leave. Lafayette did not leave. He remained on the field and continued trying to hold the line together until the retreat had taken on enough shape to be called a withdrawal rather than a rout. The distinction between a withdrawal and a rout is not a small one in military terms. A rout produces prisoners, abandoned artillery, dissolved units, and men who do not reassemble. A withdrawal produces a damaged army that reaches the next position intact enough to fight again. What happened at Brandywine on the afternoon of September 11, 1777, was closer to withdrawal than a rout, and the men who made that true, Greene south of Dilworth, Wayne at Chad's Ford, Lafayette along the breaking line at Birmingham Hill, each contributed to that outcome in ways that could not have been planned and were not recognized in any official document of the battle. Washington gave particular orders regarding Lafayette's care after the battle. He told the doctors at Bethlehem, where the wounded were being sent, to treat the young Frenchman as if he were his son. Lafayette arrived in Bethlehem on September 21, 1777, 10 days after the battle, transported by boat down the Delaware River through Philadelphia and Chester, then overland to the Moravian community that had opened its buildings to the American wounded. He convalesced in the Beckel House, the home of George Frederick Beckel, the superintendent of the community farm. He spent his weeks of recovery writing letters. To his wife he described his wound as the compliment the English had paid him. To others he described the Moravian community with the curiosity of a man seeing a world entirely unlike his own. Lafayette was 19 years old, recovering from his first wound, in a small Pennsylvania town far from Paris and Versailles, reflecting on the first day of combat he had ever seen. He had gone to the battle as an observer and had ended it on a stretcher. What he had discovered about himself on Birmingham Hill, that his instinct under fire was not to seek safety, but to find the thing that most needed, doing and do it regardless of personal cost, was not something he could have known before that day. Brandywine did not make Lafayette, it revealed him. The man who convalesced in the Beckel House in the autumn of 1777 was already, in the most important respects, the man who would command the Virginia Continental forces at Yorktown 4 years later. Washington himself reached Chester late on the night of September 11 and wrote his dispatch to the Continental Congress. The letter was characteristically measured. He reported the defeat, described the fighting, and noted the high quality his troops had shown even in adversity. He was happy to find, he wrote, that the troops were in good spirits. It was not the language of a man in despair. It was the language of a man who had lost a battle and understood what that meant for the campaign ahead, and who was already thinking about what came next. The army had survived. Philadelphia had not yet fallen. There was still time. Howe's army did not pursue beyond Dilworth that night. The men had marched 17 miles before the battle began and had then fought for hours in the September heat. They were exhausted. The British cavalry, which might have pressed the retreating Americans through the darkness, was not available in sufficient numbers to exploit the victory before nightfall. Howe chose to rest his army on the field it had won. Washington's army reached Chester sometime around midnight, with stragglers arriving until morning. The retreat had been organized well enough that the army arriving in Chester was recognizable as an army, battered, short of artillery, missing hundreds of men, but an army. Still an army. The survival of the Continental Army at Brandywine is sometimes attributed to luck, to the failing light, to Howe's exhausted troops, to the fog that had opened the day and the darkness that closed it. These things mattered. But luck requires vessels to work through, and the vessels at Brandywine were men. Greene's division arrived at Dilworth because Greene moved it there in 45 minutes. Wayne held Chadds Ford because Wayne refused to break. Lafayette stayed on Birmingham Hill because staying was the thing the situation required, and he was the kind of man who responded to situations by doing what they required. None of these things happened because of the fading light. They happened because of the men. There is something worth sitting with in the contrast between Howe's army and Washington's on the evening of September 11, 1777. Howe had won completely. His plan had worked in every particular. His troops had performed with precision from the opening march through Trimble's Ford to the final advance on Dilworth. He held the field, the road to Philadelphia, and every tactical objective of the day. And on the other side of the darkness, in Chester, the army he had just defeated was still in the war, still commanded by Washington, still coherent enough to fight, still alive. What Howe did with his victory in the days that followed would determine whether any of that mattered. It did not go the way he expected. Howe remained at the Brandywine battlefield for 5 nights after the battle ended, more than 80 hours before moving his main force. He ordered a delayed pursuit toward Chester with only 2 brigades. Historians have noted this as one of the great missed opportunities of the Philadelphia campaign. The Continental Army used those 5 days to regroup, resupply, and position itself for the next phase of the campaign. Washington was already planning. He attempted a counter-move at the Battle of the Clouds on September 16, which was frustrated by a violent rainstorm, and then another engagement at Germantown in October. The army that had been broken at Brandywine was not standing still. It was learning. Washington wrote in his dispatch to Congress that the behavior of the troops had done them great honor. This was not merely the language of a commanding general managing morale and political optics. He meant it. The men who had fought at Birmingham Hill and Chadds Ford and Dilworth had not won, but they had shown something that no defeat can entirely erase, that they could fight against the finest professional army in the world, absorb a catastrophic flanking attack, and retreat in order rather than dissolving. One American officer who fought at Brandywine wrote that it marked the moment when the Americans began to outgrow the provincial quibbles that had hampered them so often in the past. The army that walked into Valley Forge 3 months later carried that experience with it. What Baron von Steuben found when he arrived was not raw material, it was damaged steel. There is a difference. The men whose names appear in this account, Greene, Wayne, Lafayette, Washington, were not the only ones who held the army together on September 11, 1777, the soldiers of Weedon's brigade, who ran 4 miles in the September heat and then fought for another hour. The Pennsylvania line at Chadds Ford, who held their position through the entire battle and withdrew only on direct orders. The unnamed men on Birmingham Hill, who stayed in line when the men beside them were moving rearward. The teamster Edward Hector, who loaded abandoned weapons into his wagon and drove off through the British advance. None of them won the battle. All of them made it possible for the war to continue. That is its own kind of victory, quieter than the kind that gets a monument but no less real. The army reached Chester. It was still an army. The revolution was still alive. Howe had won the largest battle of the entire American Revolutionary War. And the thing he had won it to produce, the political collapse of the rebellion, the Loyalist uprising, the decisive blow that ended the war, was not there. It would not come from Brandywine, however complete Brandywine had been. It would not come from Philadelphia, however quickly Philadelphia fell. What it would come from, if it came at all, was something Howe had not yet fully reckoned with. The nature of that reckoning belongs to the next part of this story. Lafayette convalesced in Bethlehem for weeks. He wrote letters and read and waited for his leg to heal. He noted in one of them that the doctors were astonished at the rapidity with which the wound healed, and that for his part he found it most disagreeable, painful, and wearisome. He rejoined the Continental Army 2 months after Brandywine in November of 1777 at Valley Forge. He was 20 years old. The army he rejoined was cold and hungry and short of everything except the knowledge of what it had survived. He had been there when it survived it. He knew what that meant. What it meant and where it led runs all the way to Yorktown and beyond. Continental Congress did not wait for Howe's army to arrive. On the same day as Brandywine, September 11, 1777, the delegates voted to leave Philadelphia and relocate to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. They moved again within days to York, Pennsylvania, where they would spend the next 9 months conducting the business of a revolution from a small inland town while the British occupied the city that had given the nation its founding documents. The Liberty Bell was removed from Philadelphia State House and transported to Allentown, Pennsylvania, to prevent its capture. The physical objects of the revolution were carried away before the British arrived. What the British were coming for was not there when they got there. Howe's army entered Philadelphia on September 26, 1777. 15 days after Brandywine, they marched in unopposed. There was no battle for the city, no final defense, no moment of dramatic resistance. The patriots who had the means to leave had already left. One Philadelphia resident, Sarah Logan Fisher, described the days before the British arrival in terms that captured the atmosphere: wagons rattling, horses galloping, women running, children crying, delegates flying, and altogether the greatest consternation, fright, and terror that could be imagined. What remained when Howe entered was a city that had emptied itself of its political purpose before he could take it from them. The British occupation of Philadelphia was, by the standards of the expectations that had justified the entire Philadelphia campaign, an immediate disappointment. Howe had been told, and had told London, that Pennsylvania was full of loyalists who would rise to support a British army when one arrived. The Loyalist uprising did not come. Some Loyalists welcomed the British warmly and celebrated their arrival. Joseph Galloway, who had guided Howe's flanking column to victory at Brandywine and had spent years predicting that a British army in Pennsylvania would activate the loyal majority, was appointed superintendent of police for the occupied city. He worked hard. The uprising he had promised did not materialize. The population of Philadelphia during the British occupation was divided in ways that complicated every British assumption about the loyalty of the Pennsylvania population. The Loyalists who remained were a minority, and a conspicuous one. The majority of those who stayed in the city were ordinary residents who had nowhere else to go. Neither committed patriots nor committed Loyalists, simply people trying to survive an occupation that brought its own hardships. Food became scarce, prices rose. The Continental Army's patrols disrupted British supply lines from the countryside, limiting what could be brought into the city. By winter, the officers of the most powerful army in the world were comfortable in Philadelphia's finest houses, and the city they occupied was not feeding itself. Washington, far from accepting the loss of Philadelphia as a final blow, attacked Howe's army at Germantown on October 4, 1777, less than 2 weeks after the British entered the city. Howe had divided his force, leaving 3,000 men as a garrison in Philadelphia and encamping the remaining 9,000 at Germantown to the north. Washington saw the division as an opportunity and launched a complex 4-column night attack on the British position. The plan was too intricate for the army to execute precisely. Fog descended as the columns moved in, causing confusion, and some units arrived late, but the audacity of the attack sent a clear message to both sides. The army that had been broken at Brandywine 3 weeks earlier was attacking the British army in its camp. Philadelphia had not broken Washington's will to fight. Howe spent October and November 1777 reducing the American river forts that controlled the Delaware River south of Philadelphia, Fort Mifflin and Fort Mercer. Without the river clear, the British fleet could not bring supplies into the city, and Howe's army would eventually starve in its occupation. The reduction of the forts took weeks of sustained effort, cost significant British casualties, and kept Howe's attention anchored to the logistics of the occupation at the precise moment that the northern campaign was collapsing without him. Burgoyne's army had been moving south from Canada since June of 1777. The plan that Burgoyne and Howe had been expected to execute together. Burgoyne driving south through the Hudson Valley, Howe driving north to meet him and together severing New England from the rest of the colonies, had been the centerpiece of British strategy for the year. Howe had gone south. Burgoyne went south alone. He had 9,500 men when he crossed from Canada. He had expected to be met by Howe's army at Albany. He was not met by anyone except the American forces gathering to oppose him in upstate New York. The disaster at Saratoga developed across the autumn months in stages. Burgoyne won a narrow engagement at Freeman's Farm on September 19, but could not press the advantage. His supply lines were under constant pressure from American militia. At the Battle of Bennington in August, nearly 1,000 of his men had been captured in a raid meant to secure supplies. By October, his army was short of food, ammunition, and the reinforcement that had been promised and had not come. On October 7, he sent 1,600 men toward the American left in a desperate attempt to find a way through. Horatio Gates's American army counterattacked. Benedict Arnold's assault broke the British line. Burgoyne was forced back to Saratoga, where he was surrounded. On October 17, 1777, General John Burgoyne surrendered his army to General Horatio Gates at Saratoga, New York. The terms Burgoyne negotiated, the Convention of Saratoga, allowed his men to march to Boston and sail for England on the condition they would not fight again in the American War. Congress eventually declined to honor the terms. The 895 British and Hessian soldiers who grounded their arms at Saratoga on October 17 represented 86% of the expeditionary force that had marched south from Canada in June. Burgoyne had lost nearly his entire army. Howe was in Philadelphia. The coordinated campaign that was supposed to end the rebellion had ended with one army occupying a city it could not use and another army surrendering in the field. The news of Saratoga reached London in early December of 1777. The reaction in Parliament and at court was shock that quickly curdled into recrimination. Who was responsible for the failure of the Northern campaign? Howe had gone south. London had approved the Philadelphia campaign. The communications between Howe, Burgoyne, and Lord George Germain were examined and found to be a document of institutional confusion, multiple plans approved without clear coordination, multiple commanders operating with incompatible assumptions about what the others would do. The responsibility for Saratoga was distributed widely enough that no single man could be held fully accountable, which meant the lesson could not be fully learned. Howe had submitted his resignation from command in October 1777, even before the full extent of the Saratoga disaster was known in Philadelphia. He wrote to London complaining that he had not received the support he needed to conduct the campaign effectively. He cited the insufficient reinforcements, the lack of clear strategic direction from London, and what he regarded as the ministry's failure to understand the conditions of the war in North America. The letter was a document of a man who had won every battle he had fought and had come to understand in the months after Brandywine that winning battles was not going to be enough. The news of Saratoga, traveling east across the Atlantic, reached France before it reached many parts of Britain's own empire. Benjamin Franklin had been in Paris since December of 1776, working the French court with a patience and a political intelligence that matched anything the British had deployed in the field. France had been supplying the Americans with money and materiel quietly since the early months of the war. What France had not done was commit publicly. Saratoga gave Louis XVI the evidence he needed that the Americans could win. On February 6, 1778, France signed treaties of amity and commerce with the United States, recognizing American independence and entering the war as an American ally. The French alliance changed everything about the war that came after it. Britain was now fighting not a colonial rebellion, but a world war. The French Navy gave the Americans a maritime capability they had never had. French troops, French money, and French diplomatic pressure would shape every campaign from 1778 onward. The war that Howe had been fighting, a war to suppress a rebellion, to capture cities, to win decisive battles that would produce political collapse, was over. The war that replaced it was a different kind of conflict entirely, and it was a conflict that British strategy since 1777 had done almost everything possible to bring into existence. Philadelphia was occupied for 9 months. During that time, the British officer corps lived well. The social season of the occupation winter was remembered for its balls and dinner parties and theatrical performances. Sir William Howe himself was celebrated with an elaborate farewell entertainment in May 1778 called the Meschianza, a lavish event that included jousting, a regatta on the Delaware, and over 400 guests from among the Loyalist and British officer communities. It was a magnificent party for an army in the middle of losing a war. The contrast between the entertainments at Philadelphia and the conditions at Valley Forge, 18 miles to the northwest, was not lost on anyone who observed it. At Valley Forge, Washington's army spent the winter of 1777 to 1778 in conditions that had become part of the American national memory: cold, hungry, ill-supplied, living in huts they built themselves on frozen ground. Approximately 2,500 men died there from disease, exposure, and malnutrition. The Continental Army lost roughly a quarter of its strength during that winter, without a single engagement being fought. What it gained was something that could not be measured in the same way. Baron Friedrich von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge in February 1778 and began drilling the men into a professional force with the discipline, the formations, and the battlefield confidence that the army had lacked since its formation. Von Steuben's contribution at Valley Forge was specific and practical. He had served in the Prussian army under Frederick the Great and understood what professional military training produced. He wrote a training manual in French, had it translated into English, and taught it to the Continental Army in the mud and cold of the Valley Forge winter. By spring, the men who had broken at Birmingham Hill and retreated through Dilworth were drilling in formation with a precision they had not possessed before. Brandywine. The defeat at Brandywine had sent them to Valley Forge. Valley Forge had sent them back onto the field as something new. Howe was replaced by General Henry Clinton in May 1778. Clinton's first order was to evacuate Philadelphia. The city that Howe had staked the 1777 campaign on taking, that had cost Burgoyne his army in the halving, was abandoned on June 18, 1778, 9 months after the British entered it. Clinton marched his army overland to New York because the French fleet made sea transport too dangerous. Washington's army, transformed by Valley Forge, shadowed Clinton's march and forced a battle at Monmouth Courthouse on June 28. The Continental Army that fought at Monmouth was not the army that had broken at Brandywine. Everyone who saw both could tell the difference. The chain that runs from Brandywine to Philadelphia to Saratoga to the French alliance to Valley Forge to Monmouth is not a chain of British misfortune. It is a chain of consequence. Each link follows from the one before it with the kind of logical necessity that is easy to see in retrospect and was invisible to the men making the decisions at the time. Howe chose Philadelphia because Philadelphia seemed like the kind of objective that ended wars. Philadelphia fell because Brandywine had opened the road. Burgoyne was defeated because Howe had taken his army south. France entered because Burgoyne surrendered. Valley Forge transformed the Continental Army because the French alliance gave the war a future worth transforming for. None of this was planned. All of it was caused. Howe had understood the war he was fighting in tactile terms with great precision. He had a sophisticated operational method, the diversion, the flanking column, the precise intelligence network, and he had applied it with skill at Long Island, at Brandywine, at Germantown. What he had not understood was the political character of the war. He had been fighting to produce a political outcome, the collapse of the rebellion, the activation of Loyalist sentiment, the decisive engagement that would make the Continental Army's position untenable, and he had won his battles without producing any of those things. The rebellion did not collapse when New York fell. It did not collapse when Philadelphia fell. The war was not the kind of war that could be won by taking cities. When the British evacuated Philadelphia on June 18, 1778, and Washington's army marched back, in the following day, the Continental Congress returned to a city that had been occupied by the enemy for 9 months and was still standing. The Liberty Bell was brought back from Allentown. The delegates resumed their sessions. The revolution that had been conducting its business from York, Pennsylvania, was back in its capital. Howe's greatest achievement had produced this, an 8-month interruption. The Americans had used those 8 months to train at Valley Forge and to receive the French alliance. They came back to Philadelphia in better condition than they had left it. General Howe had gone home to England. The war continued without him. The strategic question that Brandywine had posed, what does a general do with a victory that changes nothing, was answered, finally, by the occupation and evacuation of Philadelphia. What Howe did with his victory was occupy a city for 8 months, watch his strategic partner surrender at Saratoga, bring France into the war, and resign his command. None of this was what winning the largest battle of the American Revolutionary War was supposed to produce. But it was what it produced. The hollow city had given Howe nothing that mattered, and everything that happened after he left, it followed from the choices he had made in the months of planning and fighting that had led him there. There is a temptation to assign Howe the full weight of blame for everything that followed. Brandywine, for Saratoga, for the French alliance, for the eventual loss of the war. That temptation should be resisted. The failures of British strategy in 1777 were institutional as much as personal. Lord Germain in London had approved 2 incompatible plans without coordinating them. Burgoyne had overestimated his own army's capacity and underestimated the American militia. The ministry had persistently misread the political character of the rebellion, believing that a sufficient show of military force would produce a loyalist majority that had never been large enough to matter. Howe operated within a system that could not think clearly about what it was trying to do. The clarity he lacked was not his alone to provide, and yet, Howe was the man who chose Philadelphia over Burgoyne. Howe was the man who spent 5 days on the Brandywine battlefield before pursuing an army that needed those 5 days to survive. Howe was the man who held the largest British victory of the war in his hands in September of 1777 and could not find a way to make it end the war. The system failed, so did the man. Both things are true. The weight of September 11, 1777, rests on both. The Meskenza, the grand farewell entertainment for Howe in May 1778, included a mock joust in which British officers dressed as medieval knights competed for the favor of young women dressed as Turkish maidens. It was performed on a lawn by the Delaware River, watched by hundreds of British officers and Philadelphia loyalists, while Washington's rebuilt army was 18 miles away at Valley Forge completing its transformation. One of the French officers on Washington's staff who heard about the Meschianza later described it as the act of men who did not understand that the war they were celebrating having fought was the war they were about to lose. The description was accurate. The party ended. Clinton took command. The evacuation began. What came next belonged to a different story, one in which Howe had no part. Philadelphia in the autumn of 1777 was the proof of something Howe could not yet name. The war in North America was not a conventional European conflict in which the capture of the enemy's capital produced the enemy's submission. It was something different, a war in which the political will of the population was the real objective, and the cities were only its symbols. Taking the symbol did not take the thing. Howe had Philadelphia for 9 months and never got closer to ending the war than he had been on the morning of September 11, 1777, when his 8,200 men stepped off from Kennett Square into the fog. He won the battle. He won the city. He lost the war. All 3 of those things happened in the same campaign, and the distance between the first and the last of them is the measure of what Brandywine actually cost the British Empire. The Continental Army entered its encampment at Valley Forge on December 19, 1777, 3 months after Brandywine, 3 months after the fall of Philadelphia, 2 months after the surrender at Saratoga. The men who marched into that Pennsylvania hillside were not the same army that had defended the Brandywine Creek in September. They were fewer. They were colder. They were short of food, clothing, shoes, and the basic provisions of a functioning military force. Washington wrote to Congress that his men were without meat, without shoes, without blankets, that they were unfit for duty for want of the essentials of a working army. What arrived at Valley Forge in December 1777 was the wreckage of a campaign. What left in June 1778 was something else entirely. The transformation at Valley Forge did not happen because of inspiration or patriotic resolve, though both were present. It happened because of a Prussian military officer named Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, who arrived at the encampment in February 1778 with European training methods, an incomplete grasp of English, and a manner of teaching that the Continental soldiers had never encountered before. Von Steuben had served under Frederick the Great in the 7 Years' War. He understood what a disciplined army looked like and how to build one. He did not stand at a distance and issue orders. He drilled the men himself, marching with them, demonstrating the formations in the mud, cursing in French and German when they blundered while his aides translated his oaths into English. The men loved him for it. What von Steuben built at Valley Forge was systematic. He began with a model company of 100 men and trained them himself, then sent them out to train the rest of the army. He wrote a training manual, initially in French, translated into English, that codified infantry drill, march discipline, camp sanitation, and the management of equipment in terms the Continental Army could understand and apply. The manual eventually became known as the Blue Book and was officially adopted by Congress in March 1779. By springs of 1778, the army that had broken at Birmingham Hill was drilling in formation with a precision it had never possessed. Valley Forge had done what Brandywine had exposed as necessary. The French alliance arrived at Valley Forge while von Steuben was drilling the men. The treaties signed on February 6, 1778, made France an official ally of the United States and brought French naval power, French troops, and French financial resources into the war. Washington read the news to his men at Valley Forge and ordered a celebration. Artillery fired, men cheered in their huts. The encampment that had been enduring the worst winter of the war marked the moment that changed its strategic character entirely. The alliance was the product of Saratoga. Saratoga was the product of Brandywine. The men celebrating in the snow at Valley Forge were celebrating a consequence of the battle that had put them there. Von Steuben was formally appointed Inspector General of the Continental Army with the rank of Major General on May 5, 1778. 3 weeks later, on May 24, General Henry Clinton replaced Howe as commander of the British forces in North America. Howe's departure from Philadelphia was marked by the Meschianza, the lavish farewell entertainment on the banks of the Delaware, and by the knowledge already circulating among the British officer corps that the war had become something it had not been. On September 11, 1777, France was now in it. The British position in Philadelphia was untenable. The city that had cost Burgoyne his army in the halving was going to have to be given back. Clinton evacuated Philadelphia on June 18, 1778, 9 months after Howe had entered it. His orders were to march his army overland to New York because the French fleet made sea transport too dangerous. Washington's army, transformed by Valley Forge, came out of its encampment and followed. The army that marched out of Valley Forge in June 1778 was the army von Steuben had built from the wreckage Brandywine had left. It was leaner, more disciplined, more capable in formation, and more confident in its own professional competence than the force that had scrambled to form a line at Birmingham Meeting House with less than 90 minutes warning. Washington forced a battle with Clinton at Monmouth Courthouse, New Jersey, on June 28, 1778. The engagement was tactically inconclusive. The British reached New York, but it proved something that no engagement before it had proved quite so clearly. The Continental Army could stand in open field combat against British regulars. It held its position under fire, executed orderly maneuvers under pressure, and withdrew in formation when the decision was made to disengage. One officer who had been present at both Brandywine and Monmouth wrote that the difference was unmistakable. The men at Monmouth were not the men at Brandywine. Valley Forge had done its work. Brandywine had made Valley Forge necessary. The chain ran clearly. The 3 years between Monmouth and Yorktown are the years in which the consequences of Brandywine played out to their final form. The French alliance brought Admiral de Grasse's fleet across the Atlantic. French troops under General Rochambeau joined Washington's army in the north. The war widened. British resources that might have been concentrated in North America were diverted to the Caribbean, to the Mediterranean, to the defense of an empire now threatened on multiple fronts by the power of France. Britain was no longer fighting a colonial rebellion. It was fighting for the empire itself, and the colonial rebellion was the least of its problems. Lafayette, who had recovered from his leg wound at Bethlehem and rejoined the army at Valley Forge in November 1777, spent the years between Brandywine and Yorktown, accumulating the experience and authority that Brandywine had begun to reveal in him. He commanded the American forces in Virginia through the spring and summer of 1781, maneuvering against Cornwallis with a tactical patience that frustrated the British general's attempts to bring him to a decisive engagement. Lafayette kept his army alive and intact through months of campaigning in Virginia, waiting for the moment that the French fleet would make a decisive strike possible. It was the lesson of Brandywine applied to a different campaign. Survival as strategy, the army preserved for the moment that mattered. That moment arrived in the autumn of 1781. Washington and Rochambeau marched their combined army of approximately 17,000 men south from New York to Virginia in a movement of strategic audacity that left Clinton in New York unable to respond before it was too late. Admiral de Grasse's French fleet engaged and defeated the British naval force at the Battle of the Chesapeake Capes on September 5, 1781, sealing Cornwallis's army inside Yorktown without hope of naval relief or reinforcement. The siege began on September 28. The bombardment opened on October 9. Cornwallis, surrounded, outnumbered, and without a viable escape route, asked for terms on October 17. 2 days later, on October 19, 1781, his army of approximately 8,000 men marched out between the lines of American and French forces and grounded their arms. Cornwallis himself did not appear at the surrender. He claimed illness and delegated the ceremony to Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, who attempted to surrender to Rochambeau rather than Washington, a final gesture of British pride that the French general declined by directing O'Hara to Washington's representative, General Benjamin Lincoln. The British band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down" as the soldiers laid down their weapons. Whether the choice was deliberate or coincidental, the title was accurate. The world had turned. The war was over in all but the formal documents that would follow at Paris in 1783. Cornwallis had led the flanking column at Brandywine with precision and authority on September 11, 1777. He had marched his 200 men 17 miles through the Pennsylvania countryside, crossed 2 unguarded fords, and appeared behind Washington's right flank at precisely the time and place the plan required. It was one of the finest tactical performances of the entire war. 4 years later, on a Virginia peninsula, with French cannon on 3 sides and the French fleet blocking the river behind him, he surrendered. The distance between those two events, the flanking march at Brandywine and the grounded arms at Yorktown, is the distance Howe's victory had to travel before it arrived at its final destination. The Marquis de Lafayette was present at Yorktown, not as a staff officer observing, as he had been at Brandywine, but as a commander whose troops had blocked Cornwallis's escape route by land, making the siege possible. He was 24 years old. He had been 19 at Brandywine, on his first day in combat, shot through the leg, staying on the field because the situation required it. The man who helped trap Cornwallis at Yorktown was the direct product of the man who had stayed on Birmingham Hill when he had every reason to leave. Brandywine had not made Lafayette. It had revealed him. Yorktown confirmed what Brandywine had revealed. Washington was also at Yorktown, the same Washington who had dismissed the warnings at Brandywine, who had lost the field and the city, who had retreated to Chester and written to Congress that he was happy to find his troops in good spirits. The man who directed the siege at Yorktown had carried every lesson of September 11, 1777, across the 4 years of campaigning that followed it. He had learned the Brandywine lesson in the way that matters most, not by studying it in retrospect, but by living with it, adapting to it, and building an understanding of the war from the reality it had exposed. The army that trapped Cornwallis at Yorktown was the product of that understanding. General William Howe was not at Yorktown. He had returned to England in May 1778, replaced by Clinton, and had spent the intervening years defending his conduct of the war before Parliament. He appeared before an inquiry in 1779 and presented his case with the care of a man who knew his reputation was being judged. He argued that his choices had been sound, that his tactical methods had been effective, that the failures of coordination with Burgoyne had not been his responsibility. He was not entirely wrong about any of it. He was also not entirely right. He had won every battle and the war had been lost. The inquiry found no specific misconduct. History found something harder to name and harder to refute. The causal chain from Brandywine to Yorktown is not difficult to trace once you know where to look. Brandywine opened Philadelphia. The Philadelphia campaign left Burgoyne without support. Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga convinced France to enter the war. The French alliance brought the fleet that sealed Cornwallis at Yorktown. At every link in that chain, a decision made in September 1777. Howe's choice of Philadelphia over Burgoyne, the 5 days on the Brandywine battlefield, the incomplete pursuit, contributed to the shape of what followed. The chain did not have to run this way. It ran this way because of specific choices made by specific men. That is what history is made of. The Battle of Brandywine is not remembered the way that Saratoga is remembered, or Trenton, or Yorktown. It was a defeat, and defeats are less comfortable to celebrate than victories. The histories of the Revolution tend to linger on the battles that turned the tide. The crossing of the Delaware, the surrender at Saratoga, the siege of Yorktown, and to move through the defeats with a certain speed, as though the losses were necessary friction rather than consequential events in their own right. Brandywine was consequential. It was the largest battle of the war. It was fought by men who had been soldiers for 2 years and who demonstrated, even in losing, that they could absorb the best the British Army could produce and survive it. There is a monument at the Birmingham Friends Meeting House near Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania, erected by Chester County schoolchildren on September 11, 1895, 118 years after the battle. It marks the approximate location where Lafayette was wounded. The meeting house still stands. Services are still held there. The graves in the adjacent cemetery include men who fell on Birmingham Hill on the afternoon of September 11, 1777. Most of them are unknown. The ground is quiet now in the way that only ground that has held extraordinary events eventually becomes quiet. Not empty, but settled, as though the weight of what happened has been absorbed into the earth itself and no longer needs to announce itself. Howe's turning of Washington's right flank at Brandywine became famous in Britain even after the war ended. Maps of the battle were produced and circulated among military enthusiasts in the late 18th century, depicting the flanking march in detail, annotating the ford crossings, marking the positions at Birmingham Meeting House. They were the maps of a victory, the kind of victory that military men study for its elegance of conception and precision of execution. They did not show what the victory produced. They did not show Saratoga or Valley Forge or Yorktown. They showed only the battle itself, isolated from its consequences, clean of the weight of what it eventually cost. That is the final lesson of Brandywine. A battle is not its outcome in the moment. A battle is what it produces across the years that follow it, in the decisions it forces on both sides, in the strategic consequences it sets in motion, in the men it shapes, and the men it removes from the field. Howe understood Brandywine as the day he won the ground and the city. He was right. What he did not understand, and what Philadelphia would spend 9 months confirming, was that the ground and the city were not what the war was about. The war was about whether a revolution could survive being defeated. At Brandywine on September 11, 1777, it survived. Everything that followed was the proof of what that survival eventually produced. Washington wrote in his dispatch after Brandywine that the behavior of the Continental Army had done them great honor. It was not the language of a man celebrating a victory. It was the language of a man who had looked at the day's fighting and found in the defeat something worth preserving. He found it in Greene's 4-mile march. He found it in Wayne's refusal to break at Chadds Ford. He found it in the 19-year-old Frenchman who stayed on the field with a musket ball in his leg. He found it in the retreat itself, ordered, disciplined, directed, that had brought an army that had just been flanked and broken to Chester, intact and ready to fight again. Honor in defeat is not a consolation. At Brandywine, it was the foundation of everything that followed. The war officially ended with the Treaty of Paris on September 3, 1783, nearly 6 years after the Battle of Brandywine. The treaty recognized the independence of the United States of America, confirmed the boundaries of the new nation, and required Britain to withdraw its remaining forces from American soil. The last British troops left New York on November 25, 1783. Washington rode into the city that same day. He gave his farewell address to his officers at Fraunce's Tavern on December 4. He resigned his commission to Congress in Annapolis on December 23. The revolution he had nearly lost at Brandywine was complete. The largest battle of the American Revolutionary War had been fought on September 11, 1777, on the fields and hills of Chester County, Pennsylvania, 25 miles southwest of Philadelphia. Britain had won it. America had lost it. Philadelphia had fallen. Saratoga had followed. Valley Forge had transformed the army. France had entered the war. Yorktown had ended it. The chain that runs from Brandywine to the Treaty of Paris is not a chain in which Brandywine is merely a link. It is a chain in which Brandywine is the hinge, the moment at which the war became the kind of war that Britain could not win, because the thing that winning required was not something Britain understood it had to do, and because the army that Howe had defeated on that September afternoon was not the kind of army that stays defeated. General Howe won the Battle of Brandywine completely. He executed a plan of genuine tactical brilliance, guided by intelligence his opponent could not match, delivered by troops who performed with professional precision across 17 miles of march and 11 hours of fighting. He entered Philadelphia. He held it through the winter. He resigned his command in the spring. He went home to England. He spent the rest of his life defending a campaign that had produced the most complete British victory of the American Revolutionary War, and nothing beyond it. The victory that changed nothing was the one that cost the British Empire everything. The Hollow City was not an accident. It was the answer to a question Britain had never learned to ask. What kind of war is this, and what does winning it actually require? On September 11, 1777, General William Howe did everything right. The flanking column marched 17 miles. The unguarded fords opened. The American right collapsed. Philadelphia fell, and the Revolution survived. That survival, bought by Greene at Dilworth, by Wayne at Chadds Ford, by Lafayette on Birmingham Hill, by Washington's decision to retreat rather than stand, was the most consequential military outcome of the entire war. Not because it was a victory, because it was a survival that became a victory. The largest battle of the American Revolutionary War ended with Britain holding the field. The war ended with America holding the continent. Between those two facts lies everything that matters about what happened at Brandywine Creek on the 11th day of September 1777. The Birmingham Friends Meeting House still holds services every Sunday at 10 in the morning. The graves in the adjacent cemetery are quiet. The Brandywine Creek runs south through Chester County toward the Delaware, past the site of Chadds Ford, past the high ground where Wayne's Pennsylvania line held Knyphausen through the long afternoon. The ground remembers nothing. The record does. September 11, 1777. 15,500 British soldiers, 14,600 Americans, 11 hours. The largest battle of the American Revolutionary War. Britain won it. What happened next is the reason you know the country that lost it. There is a painting in the rotunda of the United States Capitol. John Trumbull's depiction of the surrender at Yorktown, painted in 1820. In the foreground, on horseback, are Washington and Rochambeau, and the officers of the Franco-American Army receiving the surrender. In the middle ground, the British are laying down their weapons. And somewhere in that painting, in the crowd of officers surrounding Washington, is the Marmig de Lafayette, the man who had stood on Birmingham Hill 4 years earlier, on his first day of combat, with a musket ball in his leg, and had stayed because the situation required it. He is not in the foreground of the Yorktown painting. He does not need to be. He was already in the foreground of Brandywine on the day that made Yorktown possible, doing what the day required of him. That was enough. It was, in the end, more than enough. The Battle of Brandywine was the largest battle of the American Revolutionary War. It was the most complete British victory of the conflict. It opened Philadelphia, triggered Saratoga, produced the French alliance, sent the Continental Army to Valley Forge, and set in motion the chain of consequence that ended at Yorktown in October 1781. General Howe did everything right. He won everything he set out to win, and in winning it, he lost the war. That is the story of Brandywine. That is what General Howe did with his victory, And that is what it cost the British Empire. The question that opened this story, what does a general do with a victory that changes nothing, was answered not on September 11, 1777, but across the 4 years that followed it. What Howe did was take a city and lose a war. What Washington did was lose a battle and win a revolution. The men who stood between those two outcomes, Greene, Wayne, Lafayette, the soldiers at Birmingham Hill and Chadds Ford and Dilworth, did not know that was what they were doing. They only knew the immediate thing: hold the line, cover the retreat, keep the army alive. They did those things. The rest followed. It always does. The fog lifted on the morning of September 12, 1777. Howe's army held the fields and the fords and the road to Philadelphia. Washington's army was in Chester, 15 miles to the south, still in the war. The creek ran clear again. The hills were quiet. The smoke had settled. And somewhere on the road between Chester and the future, an army that had just been broken was already, without knowing it, on its way to winning a war that the general who had just broken it believed was over. It was not over. It had barely begun.